How do different NBA teams run their practices? Do the head coaches have all the control? Have NBA teams kept up with the latest practice techniques? The only question left is, say it with me, you win. Hey sports fans, Coach Nick here, and welcome to the B-Ball Breakdown Podcast. Today, I am pleased to bring on the show Chris Oliver, who is the University of Windsor men's basketball coach and the founder of basketballimmersion.com. So, Coach, pleasure to have you on. I think we're going to have a lot to talk about today.
Great to be here. I'm grateful to be here to be able to share the game with you and all your fans.
Cool. Well, for those of you guys who don't know, Chris and I have been talking for a long time about various things, and on his website, he's got a great resource for coaches on everything that you want, from practices to, the offenses and everything. And I thought what's kind of cool we started talking about recently was that you had a chance to attend a bunch of NBA practices in and around training camp. And I thought it'd be interesting to talk a little bit about the differences that you see between teams or the similarities. And then maybe, I can throw a couple notes in there myself from the things that I've seen in the last few years on practices as well. So, let's jump in there. I mean, tell us the teams that you got to visit and watch practice for.
Well, it stimulated my idea when I saw that your post and your interview with Steve Kerr, which was outstanding. And, you obviously got to see firsthand how they practiced and, how they interacted with each other. And as we know as coaches, it goes beyond just technical and tactical when you get a chance to see a practice. And I had a chance to see 2 practices with the Cleveland Cavaliers, 2 practices with the Milwaukee Bucks, 2 practices with the Indiana Pacers, and then a few practices with the Detroit Pistons. And, I feel that especially important was that I got to see more than just one practice with each team. So you got a chance to see, like, if one of those practices was a little lighter, the next one would be a little bit more competitive 5-on-5. And I think I got a little bit better feel for how they're trying to do things and how they approach things in terms of that.
So I guess we all have to know is, do the Cavs work on transition defense at all?
Well, in the practices that I saw, it's pretty stereotypical, I think, probably what you saw as well in terms of practices at the NBA level. And, some type of pre-practice was shooting or work with an assistant coach. And then usually they got into walkthrough and then some type of warm-up with a staff member in terms of the physical warm-up, dynamic warm-up. And then usually from there, some full-court warm-up drill or a 3-man weave or 5-ball shooting, which we can circle back to because I'd love to talk about that. Okay. And then some type of full-court competitive, then defensive drill, and then all the practices I saw had station work as well, which was probably something that you would see a little bit more at that level because they clearly have a lot of staff on the court as well and a lot of coaches that have a lot of expertise to offer. So I thought that was interesting. And then from there, 5-on-0 repetitions, scrimmage, and then post-practice was some type of block shooting repetitions and work with assistant coaches. So somewhere in there, some of the practices, I saw some transition defense, but I did not see that with Cleveland. Now, in fairness, I did see them the second day they started practice, so maybe they covered that the first day.
Maybe. Now, what's interesting is you said you saw a lot of, oh my goodness, what would you say? You saw, individual training what? My mind is mush. In the beginning, you'll see them doing really basic fundamental drills, right?
Yeah, pre-practice shooting and some work with assistant coaches in terms of some type of development and, just, I guess, a focus specifically on the individual player, which, I think is important. At that level, the individual player wants to get better. It's not just about the team. They want to individually get better. And, that's an individual motivation to continue their career and excel at their career. And, I think that was particularly important to note. And, there was a lot of work pre and post practice in that area. And I think post practice was more repetitions of shooting, whereas pre practice was a little bit more, cuts off of different sequences or whatever it may be.
Sure. It's funny because when I've seen them do that where they'll do really basic stuff like inside out dribble, maybe there's a coach pushing them or whatever, and they go through cones and do kind of passing. And I find that kind of funny because in the training camp practices are a little bit different than when you're in the regular season when they're all hell is breaking loose. They don't have time to do a lot of stuff. So I just found it kind of funny that they decided to start the season doing those because knowing they'll never do them again after that. And it's almost just like they're kind of doing it to do it, knowing that I would imagine most of those players, if not all the players on their own, are doing their individual work. Everyone's got their own coach now, and so I found it funny they would take the time to do station work on skills. Were you seeing a lot of that too, like dribbling stuff?
I didn't see a lot of pylon stuff, but again, I think because it was early in the practice phase that a lot of those practices were introducing the main team concepts. But I know totally what you're talking about. I had a chance this summer to watch Sam Remy train a few players in Florida. And what I learned through that and through talking to some of the NBA assistant coaches in particular was that these guys travel throughout the year and work out with the players, on an individual basis. And, it sounds like NBA teams are very welcoming in that way, that they have an open door policy to any player's trainer, and and that's part of that process that probably happens in his hours outside of practice for an individual player. But in terms of on the court, I mean, it definitely, all the skill work tended to be more geared towards the offensive development of the player, or in some cases some walkthrough pre-practice with some of the newcomers to the team, in terms of some of the system stuff or defensive stuff with the defensive coordinator or another coach that way. So there's definitely some attention to detail that they're trying to focus on, but I saw less of kind of that stereotypical type of individual cone work or different stuff like that.
Well, what percentage would you say how it breaks down from offense versus defense and how they're working on that?
By and large, all offense. And, and again, it could be, it's not a judgment. It could be more just the practice phase I saw. But certainly in terms of Milwaukee and Detroit, there was a lot more balance, I thought, in terms of the offense versus defense. And, Cleveland, as particularly the one practice I saw, was mainly on air. And they told me that had something to do with the Players Association, that when you practice 2-a-days, that one of those practices has to be not competitive, so you can't scrimmage in the one practice, which again I found interesting. I don't know the rule, and but they had one practice was basically offensive repetitions and walkthrough, and then the second practice they had more competitive 5-on-5 type of scrimmages and stuff like that, and that was another interesting phase, was how they competed in practice. And I think the mindset of some fans is maybe a little different than the reality in terms of how players approach practice at the NBA level. And I saw a lot of commitment to the craft and a lot of commitment to improvement from all players. And at no point did I see any coach interact in a negative way with a player. Mm-hmm. Everything was very positive in terms of coaching and development, and really focusing on being demanding without being demeaning, and that was great to see. And that's what you would expect at that level, that it shouldn't take a lot of motivation to be able to get those players excited to be able to develop.
Sure. Well, let's get some observations you had specifically about the head coaches, because I'm curious. When you're watching a Milwaukee Bucks practice, is Jason Kidd running the entire thing? Is he really vocal out there? Is he commanding all these different things, or are the assistants helping out? How does that dynamic work?
Well, a lot of the coaches definitely delegated in the 3 practices outside of Detroit. Stan Van Gundy definitely was very involved in a lot of the coaching, but at the other 3 practices, there was a lot of delegation. I believe that of those 4 teams, 3 of those teams have designated defensive coordinators as well, where Sean Sweeney at Milwaukee, he did a lot of the defensive stuff, but I think he's designated as such. So that was his responsibility, and Coach Kidd was very empowering, I thought, to his staff as well, which again, I would hope that would be part of the benefit of coaching at the NBA level. It's that you're a head coach, you have really qualified people to delegate to, but definitely Coach Kidd was very involved in the practice. And in terms of I guess the main question that you get back to is, how much stopping and starting was there within practice to actually provide feedback to players? And that's something I'm always interested in as a coach, because I'm a big believer that feedback, by and large, especially in a development phase of a practice, needs to be immediate. And giving feedback, after 3 up and downs, or giving feedback after 10 minutes of a scrimmage isn't that impactful. So it was interesting to see that a lot of the teams, with the exception of the Pistons, let their players play with very little feedback within the game, or within the scrimmage, or within the competitive drill. And, whereas in Detroit, they tended to stop it and correct it immediately and then move on. And, it all comes back to philosophy as a coach, but certainly I was more in line with that in terms of my view of how players learn.
Totally. And I know that everyone would be better off if they learn about MeUndies. I mean this when I say they will be the most comfortable pair of underwear you'll ever wear. The material is 3 times softer than cotton, with an incredible selection of styles and patterns to choose from. Can you tell from my voice that I'm wearing my pink MeUndies right now? The second you slip these babies on, you'll know what I mean. And they've got them for men and women, if that's your thing. For a limited time, you can even buy a glow-in-the-dark print called Lights Out, and I can think of a few worthwhile uses for such a thing. And if you visit MeUndies.com/CoachNick, you'll get 20% off your order. And they also have socks. The shipping is free, the fabric is soft, and your life will improve. So head over to MeUndies.com/CoachNick for 20% off and move through life in a cloud of soft support. Right, and so I'm just so I'm clear, so you didn't see no one stopping right away to make a teaching point in the middle of a scrimmage.
Right, and there's no definitives here. There's no ones. It was by and large, there was very little stopping at the Pacers practice, at the Bucks practice, or at the Cleveland practices in terms of the flow of the practice. And I actually got a chance to ask all 3 different staffs a question about that, about scrimmaging and why they didn't stop it and give feedback. And their response, and maybe this has something to do with the fact, because they all alluded to it, that all 3 of those coaches were former players and that they liked it when practice flowed without stopping. Whereas Coach Van Gundy's obviously a coach who's developed through coaching ranks more than as a player, and that his mindset is more that we've got to stop and correct, and then we've got to move on. And they said that in the scrimmages they wanted it to flow. And from what I understand of a scrimmage, if it truly is a scrimmage from an evaluation standpoint, then that's absolutely a benefit. To just let it flow, you're sitting back, you're evaluating your team, you're evaluating what you need to work on, what you need to develop. But if there's actually a focus on improvement and development of certain things that you've coached within the body of the practice, then you need to hold your players accountable to those things. And that's definitely what I saw more with the Pistons practice in terms of them stopping it and holding them accountable to something they taught in a drill previously.
Okay. Now, and I guess that does talk to attention to detail a little bit. And I felt like, do you feel like there was a wide range between those teams of how closely attentive they were to the details of the offense and spacing and timing and movement? Incredibly
different, for sure.
Okay.
And and that had. I think we sometimes assume that the NBA is a little bit of a cookie cutter league in terms of everyone does the same thing, everyone uses the same terminology, and I didn't see that. I saw a lot of different terminology for the same thing. I saw a lot of different approaches in terms of philosophies. I mean, certainly Indiana was trying to play through the post a little bit more, which is counter to kind of the modern game but they have Miles Turner inside, so they were trying to do some stuff to be able to play through him, whereas most of the other teams were more. A little bit more pace and space, although the Pistons certainly aren't playing with much pace. But is definitely different in terms of the approach and the attention to detail. I guess the other thing that really came through is that, it just, there wasn't a great balance, I thought, between stopping and starting practice, in terms of actually coaching. And I relate this back to, I once saw an NCAA coach run a practice where they spent 10 minutes on a closeout drill. And every mistake that a player made in the closeout drill, the whole team had to run. And then when I saw them scrimmage later for about 15 minutes of practice, not one time did I see that player actually apply what the coach was trying to, hold them accountable to in the drill. And it makes you wonder, why did you do the drill if you're not going to hold them accountable in the game?
Well, it also makes you wonder how running sprints helps you improve your closeouts.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm on board there. I mean, I'm not a big fan of, and I didn't see a lot of punishment or anything like that in the NBA practices. Although certainly they did a few time drills, where I saw, the traditional time drill where, and this comes back to 5-ball shooting, which is, you go 3-man weave down the floor, a player shoots the ball on a layup, and then the other 2 players get a pass from the baseline, and they each shoot a 3. And then the 3 on the baseline go the other way, and it's a progressive drill that keeps going like that, 3-man weave, and everyone gets to shoot. Well, I believe the Milwaukee Bucks did it for 4 minutes, and they had to reach a certain score. If they didn't reach the score, then the whole team ran, and they didn't reach it, they repeated the drill. And it was just fascinating to see that, because I think by and large, when you come back to a lot of the skill acquisition and learning literature, that a lot of what that drill doesn't transfer to performance. So why are they doing it is my question. And
right. I could tell you why.
Yeah.
They're doing it because that's what their coach did when they were playing, especially the ex-players. And I think that's an interesting thing that we've discovered with these ex-players and of a certain era. So I would probably put Nate McMillan in the same genre of coach as Sam Mitchell, Byron Scott, right? These guys all played around the same time. And that was when this was just the tail end of what we have to come up with a name for it, the paleo coaching, whatever era from about 1960 to 1995, or maybe it feels like nothing changed in coaching as far as how you organize your practices and what the drills you ran and how we looked at the game, and maybe even later than that, because I feel like the explosion of what we've discovered recently is much more recent. But would you put Nate McMillan? I mean, by the way, Jason Kidd is on the tail end of that kind of genre or that era as well, because I'm sure that's what I find interesting is that I feel like these guys. I don't know if they're going to a lot of coaching clinics and getting any kind of cutting edge stuff. I mean, I've been to my share. I've never seen anybody there into the big ones, and maybe they're speaking at them. They don't actually listen to the other people speaking. So, I mean, I guess that's my concern. And just to throw this out there, like the reason why I'm kind of negative on a guy like Sam Mitchell, because he was very candid in a couple of these interviews he's had over the years. And you could hear that he just seems frustrated with young players coming in these days who don't have the kind of fundamentals that he had coming out of college for 4 years. And he expresses the frustration while he's coaching. I have no doubt that was going on. And the players are going to turn off in 2 seconds of feeling that. And I really kind of feel like Nate McMillan, I don't know if he's the same way, but did you get a feeling of that at all when you were watching them practice?
100%. So, there were a few stretches where players were doing 5-on-0 repetitions of offense for about 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
20 minutes. And, at one point I looked at one of the Cleveland lineups had Calderon, Corver, Jeff Green, who else was involved in that? And 5 guys that combined experience is over 40 years of NBA experience.
Okay.
And what we know, and what basically my obsession with, is that nothing they did in that 20 minutes stimulates their thinking, and nothing that they did in that time increases their enjoyment of practice, improves their retention, or increases their transfer of the skills and decisions that the coach was teaching to games. And that's proven by skill acquisition evidence that goes back well before these coaches started coaching. This isn't new. And it speaks to your point, which is, how are these coaches learning some of these things? Well, I think the NBA has obviously made incredible strides in terms of their advancement of analytics, their advancement of human performance, and, tracking of wearable technology and different things like that. But what I saw in these practices and all the other practices that I've attended through the last few years is that there's been no improvement in actually applying learning theory and skill acquisition knowledge to NBA practices or NCAA practices by and large. And I think that's what was unique about the Pistons practice, is that I would say for the most part, everything they did was more game-like, and everything they did was more offense versus defense, which again transfers the important information to a game, which is kind of, as a coach, I think what we should be focusing on in terms of advancing our players.
And that makes a lot of sense. I was a basketball manager, a student manager at Wisconsin, and Coach Van Gundy was the assistant at that time there for 2 years. So he definitely seemed progressive in the way he approached the game. So I'm not surprised to hear that his practices are like that, which is great. And again, I've been to plenty of practices where you're right. There just seems to be a lack of. I think that a lot of times they feel like they're so good, that they're, throwing the ball out there. That typical thing you hear about high school coaches. Oh, we're going to throw the ball out, let them play. But I think that actually becomes more prevalent in the NBA. And the thing I find funny was I'm looking through Giannis's stuff. I just did a big breakdown of him, and I was watching the game last night, and he's incredible. He's scoring all these points. But the thing I found really interesting about their offense, for instance, is that and I actually quoted this out on Twitter, where they're having trouble with spacing, But it's not because they don't have shooters. It's because the way they're moving off ball is all bunched up. There's no detail there. And it's weird because I don't normally see that. It's usually easy enough. So, like, were you watching the Bucks practices and were they, obviously, I think you said they probably aren't going to blow the whistle immediately and say, hey, you need to be on the wing instead of in the mid-post area. Are they doing that kind of stuff?
No, there's very little development without correction. And, there wasn't a lot of correction. There wasn't a lot of, those situations, as you're saying that, hey, you're not in the right spot. We need to focus on this, and then why we need to focus on this. And I think as a coach, that's so important. And you can't be afraid, especially early on in the season, to stop your players and, again, hold them accountable to what you want to have happen. And they're not going to learn just by rolling out the balls. They need feedback, whether that's feedback through the use of questions to stimulate their thinking, or whether it's the use of, you providing them the information. I mean, I generally come back to these two things. When I look at a drill and I say, is it game-like, and will it transfer skills to performance? And we know that, like, a three-man weave, and again, this is not judgment of the three-man weave. If you use it, it's great. But it doesn't really transfer anything to a game. And that's what I guess I look at the NBA and I say, well, it definitely doesn't transfer anything to a player at that level, because
right.
They're well beyond that in terms of their expertise. And you could argue three-man weave is great for a new learner. It's their initial learning of the game, and it's a movement skill and all that. But once you get to the NBA level, I mean, the decision is harder than the skill. The decision is harder than the skill, and that's what you're talking about with Giannis. It's like his development is not skill-based at this point, although obviously his shooting needs to improve and different things like that. There's minimal development in terms of his skill. But what's really can improve is his decision-making. And I think that's where we miss the boat a lot as coaches, that we focus so much on technique and skill, but we don't focus enough on actually decisions. And the only way to truly, truly stimulate decisions is to put them in a situation where they have the distracting information that exists in a game and the visual cues that are present in a game. And that doesn't happen if it's on air. You need offense versus defense.
Which is why I reacted so surprised when you told me they ran 20 minutes of 5-on-0 offense, because, it's funny, I can compare this to what I've seen in the Warriors practices, which could very well be skewed because obviously they're the best team in the world, and they sort of, they are. And you can argue that it doesn't matter what they would do in practice because they are so good. But I will tell you this, a couple different things. Let me ask you this. Did you see anybody, did they go through film before the practice started?
So I asked the coaches some of that because my exposure to, more video and everything is through Hard Knocks and then the NFL, where they really show you what happens at a training camp. And I honestly didn't know what they do off the court at an NBA practice. I've only been to the practice. I haven't been to the video. But I did ask them if they do film and video, and they do. They said they do that. Off the court. But I am definitely curious how much they do at that point, and then whether they have those meetings where they do terminology, where they do covering, different situations and different things like that. Because the other thing I saw a lot was about a 15-minute phase, maybe a little bit longer, that was walked through at the beginning of practice prior to the start of their, dynamic warm-up phase. And again, what I know is that essentially in those situations, even if there's 10 players on the floor, there's 5 to 10 off the floor that are just standing there for about 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. And we know that does not impact learning. That doesn't. I mean, no matter what you do. And that was another thing. I mean, the 5-on-0 reps, okay, fine. You're going to do 5-on-0 reps. But there's still a better way to do 5-on-0 reps to be able to maximize a player's time on task. And I saw some NBA teams that had 2 beautiful courts, and they would have one group of 5 go there and back on one court while the 15 other players just stood off on the sidelines. Mm-hmm. And, obviously there's different ways to do it, but you could have teams cycle around the 2 courts. You could have teams go cross court. If you only had one court, you could have one group of 5 go one way while the other group goes the other way, and creates kind of some intentional chaos. But anything other than just 5-on-0 with one group going and everyone else watching. Because they're getting anything out of that experience.
Right. And so, okay, because the Warriors, they start every practice with film on the court. They have a whole thing that's set up there, so they literally could watch and it's not long. As a full group, they don't go that long. It's maybe 7-8 minutes of video, maybe even less. And they make their points. They put the stuff with graphics on the screen while they're talking, very quickly, but everyone together on the court, and they can get right on the court and actually start doing what they've been talking about. The other thing they do, though, which I think we've already answered, was that they will do a full defensive skill work, skills and drills for 25 minutes every practice, no matter what. No matter what, no matter how long the practice is.
Was that offense versus defense?
No, they have very specific and awesome defensive closeout drills and rotational drills that it's funny because at one point I'm like, that doesn't look really like game-like situation to me, the way they're doing these things. And then sure enough, that night they had the exact same rotation and closeout that they did in that drill. And I was like, oh my God, like I guess I had never seen that really, but now I'll see it every time. And so Ron Adams, who runs that, he's the defensive guy. He gets his 25 minutes every practice. Like they might have a practice that only goes 50 minutes, and he'll get his 25 just on defense alone. It speaks volumes to me. The one thing that we both lack, I don't know if you've ever seen a Popovich practice. Have you?
No, unfortunately, no. But, that would be something. I mean, there's a number of coaches that I think might do things differently from my viewpoint. But I don't know. Again, without being there, it's really hard to evaluate a coach, in my opinion. And, that's ultimately it. And even then, I say Coach Van Gundy did the best job, but that doesn't mean his team's going to be the most successful of that group of four, obviously. Because ultimately it comes back to, personnel. And, clearly having a Giannis is going to make you a better coach, and that's still the blueprint for success. And so when you talked about the Warriors doing video like that, I love that. I mean, some of the NBA teams look like they were set up to be able to do video right there on the court. And I'm not here saying they didn't do it before, but when you say they did video and they went right to applying those concepts, did they walk through them or did they do them within a drill work immediately afterwards?
Yeah, usually they would do it that way. I mean, although I have to think that in training camp, as I'm thinking about it now, they would talk about the concepts and then they would do their warm-up stuff for a few minutes, but then they would get into it and they do the breakdown stuff. So they do the 3-on-0 and 3-on-3 stuff, which I think is really important because when you're talking about offense, it's really three players are usually involved in the scoring, and then the other two are on the weak side or whatever's happening, and you get a lot more reps that way. And they will mix it up where they make the guys play with different players too, which I thought was interesting too, to kind of get some familiarity, to breed team. Otherwise, if you're always playing your starters together, then you kind of, I know you want to develop that chemistry, quote unquote, but you also want to develop a team, right?
Thank you. What a great observation. And I observed that the same way, and I got frustrated almost watching, some of the players that might be 10 through 15, never getting a chance to play with some of the better players and really never mixing any of the lineups the whole time I was there. And I thought that was confusing because, again, we know that part of the NBA lifestyle is that you're going to play so many games, you're going to play back-to-backs, you're going to play these crazy schedules, and now you've got to make sure that you're constantly shifting your lineups, changing your lineups. You've got to play with different players, and I didn't see much mixing. And I'm definitely a big believer of that in terms of our practices. That we try and constantly mix, and if anything, I don't make teams at all. So our players make their own teams and get a chance to lead each other and have different lineups every day because you never know who you got to play together.
Right,
so that's a good observation.
And the camaraderie also, because the 14th man would end up making an awesome play and scoring, and they celebrate that. That's really, and then you kind of see that resulting on the bench in a game if he's in and he does it right. That's all been developed in the practices. It's not like it's almost not spontaneous in the games because it's that same thing that developed. Because Steph will throw McAdoo a pass and he dunks it or whatever, and they're all like they get excited about that, and that's what's so great. I know in Steve Kerr's interview with me, we talked a little bit about that notion of, he could just run pick and roll with KD and Steph every single time, but that's going to get Draymond and Klay just standing there for the whole possession, just waiting for the ball to maybe come to them every fifth time. And that's what doesn't make for good, what did he use? He said, good energy, but also, you want to have morale on your team high, and that's, you want to feel like you're part of it.
Yeah, and I've seen NCAA teams practice in particular where the walk-ons and the non-scholarship players or the guys that aren't in the rotation just stand there the whole practice, or they end up being, just dummy players or, passers or different things like that. And exactly what you said, how is that interesting and how is that engaging and how does that help your team build its morale and its cohesion? It doesn't.
How about this? I've seen those practices where the assistants don't do anything either. They're standing there alongside those guys and they can't do anything, and the coach does. So I won't name names. And by the way, we're not here to crap on coaches.
No.
And that's the thing, to get back to the Sam Mitchell thing about the frustration. I've said this before, people maybe have heard this on the podcast before, but, rather than express frustration at a player who doesn't know how to properly pivot, on the right side of the floor, and I'm because I think what happens is he goes, no one taught you this? What's wrong? How can you not know this? Instead, you got to be coming at it like, this is the first time you're going to watch Star Wars, right? That's how exciting it is. I'm going to show you something you haven't seen before. This is amazing, and you're going to love it. Like, that's what it needs to be. And that could very well be for a pivot or a footwork thing, or it could be an offense. Like, oh my God, you haven't ever run zipper in an offense? This is great. Like this rookie who's coming in. This would be really fun. You're going to love it, and we're going to, So I think it's that kind of thing that you have to be very careful with. And I have to imagine the younger coaches coming in have a better sense of that versus the Byron Scott, Sam Mitchell, Nate McMillan guys who, we saw Byron Scott torture D'Angelo Russell on purpose in his rookie year. He did it on purpose. He thought he was making him a tougher player.
Well, and I'm sure you do this too. Like, you sit there as an observing coach, and part of the fun of going to these practices is that I put myself in the shoe of the coach and say, what would I do if I was coaching this team, and how would they respond to my methodology and my approach? And I know that my methodology and my approach would be very different than what a traditional player has come up with in terms of block practice, on-air drills, not as much competitive, and then obviously incorporating concepts like random and variable practice rather than doing the block repetitions of shooting. And I think by and large, these guys are professionals who want to get better, so that if you can somehow convince them, the why, which is obviously part of what Golden State has probably done, to a phenomenal level, is just convince them the why. The why should we defend as a group? Why should we play together? Why should we share the ball? Why should we try and lead the league in number of passes per game? All those different whys are the part that ultimately I think as coaches and as fans that, maybe we don't see behind the scenes, but those are the things that I think make teams most successful, even more than scheme.
Right. And what you have to focus in on that, I think, is the process, because, like you said, Stan Van Gundy had the most attention to detail. And so when he's running his practices and he's trying to, get it what he's trying to get through, they might not make all those shots, but you can see the execution in what they're doing. So a fan or the person who doesn't see deeply into what the Detroit Pistons are doing simply says, oh, they're 1-3, they stink. When in reality, they're getting really good shots. They're just not going. It's a make or miss league, like they talk about all the time here, and you have to be able to notice that and see that for what it is, and that's sort of what you have to embrace as a coach. I think that's what we're also going through as far as we're not. If you get too caught up in the results at any level, then the emotions become too much of a problem, and I think that's another issue. So, like Brad Stevens ends up being the poster child, I imagine, right? Have you ever had a chance to see him coach?
I have not, but I would be very interested. And I've talked to some people that have been involved in his staff. One of his managers actually works with the Pistons as a video coordinator, and we talked about that. And
T.J. Saint.
Yeah, T.J. Saint, and does an outstanding job with the Pistons, and just a phenomenal learner. And that, I love being around, and I'm sure you do too. I love being around coaches, and that's part of what the benefit of what I've done with basketball immersion, and I'm sure what you've done too, is that I love being around learners and people that are engaged in their learning, and they want to be active participants in their learning. And TJ is a great example of that. And Charles Klass with the Detroit Pistons, they've been outstanding in terms of my learning curve at the NBA level.
Sure.
But he talked about definitely it seemed to be that Coach Stevens approached it from more of a small-sided games approach, and like you said, a breakdown of offense where it's a 3-on-0, 3-on-3 type situation. And anyone that's read any of my stuff knows I'm a huge fan of small-sided games, and I believe that's where your true development takes place, whether it's in a 5-on-5 or a 3-on-3 or a 4-on-4. That's where you can really break down the situations in a game-like way that actually transfers to performance. And I would love to see if he does that at the NBA level, because here's the question, Coach, and this would be applying to what you saw with the different practices too, is when I leave those practices, I come away and say, okay, I believe my concepts could work. However, the balance is always the workload versus the development. And there's a conscious effort, I'm sure, to lower the workload of certain players within practice, within, training, because you know how many minutes they're going to play. Mm-hmm. So, were they doing that with Golden State? Was there certain players that had a lower workload, whether it's the Durants and the Stars or different things like that?
I always saw, Durant and Curry doing everything. I never saw them sitting out, so they all did it. They all treated it. Here's the thing I think people don't understand is these practices look very similar to the college practices you're going to go to. I have to tell you, I don't want to toot my own horn, but my high school practices looked a lot like we did a lot of the same drills. And I always think that's great. It's like, hey, I ran that drill. Like whenever I see them do it, like it feels like some weird connection because, there is a finite amount of knowledge and theory and there's a finite amount of drills you can run. Well, actually, let's not say there's a finite amount of knowledge, but there is certainly these drills they're all iterations of each other. And so it's not like there's all this whole. I think people had a hard time when I first started doing this because I would say I was a high school coach, and the reaction was always, well, you don't know anything. You just coach at the high school level. And clearly the guys who are in the NBA know everything and know the most because they're in the NBA. And again, we're not here to crap on anybody or make them small or whatever. But we're just I like to point out that like some of the best coaching is like at your level or at these what would you say are you Division III? Would that be what you are?
Well, it's hard to distinguish. I mean, there's only one division in Canada, but we beat all levels of American teams. Like we beat Division Ones, we beat Division Twos, we beat Division Threes, but we've lost all levels of those too. Because there's obviously, as you just said, there's really good teams at all levels of basketball, and there's really good coaches at all levels of basketball. But you're bang on in the sense that I think we have an obsession with celebrity coaches, and they are not necessarily the best teachers. They're not necessarily the best coaches. Often the celebrities are the ones with the best players, and that's how they become celebrities because they're successful. I think there's certainly exceptions to that, and I certainly wouldn't name names, but like I've been to some big-time Division I practices from celebrity coaches, and I'm just walking away.
I hear you.
There's absolutely nothing there that I take away that's going to help what I do already, and I get what you're saying, that your practices are very similar. And I would say in a lot of contexts, my practices are very similar too. But I think the context, it only varies, is that we go almost immediately to offense versus defense and do very little on air. And that's more of a progression that coaches go through as the season progresses. But I would do that from day one, where we don't do any on-air drills.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you say that because, like, what I used to do is start out with a triangle offense, 2-on-0, 3-on-0 for a week, and not put defense on it, thinking we wanted to really master the patterns. And what I discovered was my teams would start out slow in every game, and eventually, midway through the first quarter, we kind of wake up and start playing better. And I'm convinced that it was because I didn't make those 2- and 3-line drills, with defense on them early enough. And I think I eventually did, and I would, but it wasn't a stress until my last year. And it was frustrating because I can still remember maybe the second year I was coaching this last time, and we had a great practice, a great drill where I just threw out defense randomly. I'm like, all right, let's play some defense on this drill. And it was it was so good. And it had everything. It had competition. The kids were learning. They were figuring things out. And it took me 6 more months and I never forgot it, but it took me 6 months to say, wait a minute, we need to redo that and actually make it a staple of what we're doing. And now I can't say it enough. And I think the fear is that coaches are afraid that Bobby Knight's going to walk in and see this chaotic mess going on and think that this guy doesn't know what he's doing, when in fact that's the learning going on.
Oh, it's so true. And you have to be okay with the mess, and you have to be okay with it being ugly. And that's learning. Everything's bad before it's good. And it's okay to be messy. And what we do know is that basketball is a game where no skill is executed 2 times the same way.
Right.
So technique is tactically and context specific. So if we're practicing it in isolation, it's not going to transfer. So you coming to that conclusion and saying, hey, listen, even though we might struggle a little bit early in terms of how we execute, having the defense there gives them the context right away that's going to be transferring to the game. And I cannot encourage coaches enough. If you're afraid of going, say, from 5-on-0 to 5-on-5, just go 5-on-1. Adding one live defender or 2 live defenders completely changes the context of running an offensive play. All of a sudden, you've got more game-like passes, you've got more game-like decisions, and you've got more game-like timing. Because I remember one of my players in one of my exit interviews, it was my 3rd year of coaching, and I asked a player, I said, what thing did you find the least stimulating about practice? He goes, Coach, there's nothing less interesting than 5-on-0 inbound. Like, there's nothing more boring than 5-on-0 inbound. And you're absolutely right. 5-on-0 inbound is boring. So how do we train it? Well, we add 2 or 3 live defenders right away that can do anything and take away anything, because at least now you're stimulating some type of decision that goes along with you learning the pattern. And that's an important part of the process. And, and again, it comes back to the NBA practices where you watch and you go, really, does Jose Calderon need 15 minutes of 5-on-0? No. I mean,
no.
He could pick up anything. You diagram it, he could run it.
Oh, but yeah. The Warriors literally would put a new set in 5-on-0. They do it like 2 times. And then they go out and they run it perfectly that night in the game. But the work had already been done. That's, I think, the point there is. It's not like they're the only team that could do that. But because they had already done all that work with all their skilled work, I mean, they do all that stuff in the beginning and the conceptual part of it, then they can easily put it together later very quickly and then get into the 5-on-5. I mean, it's without question, it's imperative. Even the 6-7-year-olds that I coached my son at the YMCA in Hollywood, like, I was all concerned. They couldn't barely catch. They couldn't really dribble. And finally, after a few weeks of like just doing all these stationary drills, I'm like, no, we're going to play 2-on-2 and 3-on-3. And it looked like a bomb had dropped on that court. But you know what? They started playing a lot better in those games, because they taught themselves a little bit more than me sitting here yakking my brains out.
No question. Coaches are obsessed with the perfect practice. And I would argue that if your team is doing something perfect, they're not learning anymore. And the same thing applies to a drill. If you're doing the same drill in the middle of the year or the end of the year that you did at the beginning of the year, then you're not improving. Like, you're not adding anything new. You're not adding a layer of challenge, and there's no greater challenge than live defense. Yeah. And and you've got to get there, and it's got to be ugly. And I'm okay with the ugly. We're ugly right away, and I'm okay with it. But I get that some coaches, that's more of a progression. But I just think as a coaching world, we do too much on air. We do too many drills that don't transfer, and we do too much on air without defense or without live offense versus defense.
And by the way, I've had coaches argue with me that they want to start every one of their practices all year long with the same drills. And I don't know. I can't do that. I need to break it up, and otherwise, because people think, oh, it's reassuring. They know every practice is going to start the same way. But to me, it's just like you tune out after a week of doing that, and even if you put defense into those drills. So I'm always that guy that's always trying to just mix it up, stir it up. Even with the Warriors in their film sessions, they always have something funny in their film sessions as well. They'll stick something in there, and with even if you're at the high school level with the technology, it's not hard to like do some editing or some fun stuff, and anybody can kind of do that now. So it's really important, and you can Phil Jackson's fingerprints are all over that. I think Brian McCormick's fingerprints are all over our discussion right now as far as talking about fundamentals. But we got to talk about. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, you're right. I mean, everything that I try and do, ultimately, in terms of deciding what we're going to run, deciding how we're going to practice, what drill we're going to do in practice, comes back to player satisfaction. I want my players to enjoy the experience of practicing, because a certain amount of practice, no matter what we do as coaches, is monotonous and boring because it's repetition, right? And if you're doing the same thing every day, then there's no question that's not interesting to the players. But how about for the coach? I think what coaches forget all the time, and I get in these discussions sometimes on Twitter too, is that coaching is about your development too. So where's your room for experimentation? Where's your room for trying something? And you and I have probably tried drills before. We went in, we thought this was the greatest drill in the world, this is going to solve a problem, and it's a disaster. And it's a great learning experience for you as a coach to try things sometimes and learn from them, whether it's a set or a play or different things like that. And that learning and failure process is important for a coach just as much as it's for a player. And if I was to say one thing I believe about our Canadian game and about the FIBA game and the international game is, I just find there's a lot more creativity, and whether it's the high stakes that exist in the NCAA or the NBA, but there tends to be a lot more repetition of the same thing over and over again. As you said, it goes back to generations of coaches that have done it before, so we're going to do it. Whereas I think because we have less pressure, maybe we're able to try and experiment. And I coached 1,000 games, I think, before I coached my first university game. And that's because I coached all levels of basketball while I was an assistant coach. So I got to try stuff, and I just go in, and every day it was like, I'm going to try this, going to see if it works, it doesn't work. And you get to form a philosophy by doing that.
Okay, we have to get into this. I got to talk to you about the Cleveland Cavaliers practices. I got to know, don't throw anybody under the bus, who coaches the team?
So, definitely the assistant coaches were very involved. Ty Lue was very soft-spoken, but very involved in terms of a lot of the things that they did. But I will say this. If you looked at my notes from the Cleveland Cavaliers practice, I would tell you that they were pretty short. Again, I don't mean that to be disparaging. I just mean that the two practices I saw were this. The first practices was largely walkthrough, 5-on-0, some skilled station work, and then that was it. And then the second practice was largely, warm up, 5-on-0, and then scrimmage. So I didn't see a lot of technical, tactical correction or coaching in those two practices. And I don't know if that's a reflection of what we see on the court. Whereas, in one practice, watching Coach Van Gundy run a practice, 2-hour practice, man, my pages of notes were just, I'm 10, 15 pages
wow.
in, and my hands hurt. Because
did you see LeBron? Was LeBron involved at all?
Okay, so that's an outstanding question because he was amazing. Like everything that you would think about LeBron was true. I mean, he was a presence in everything they did. He asked questions. I didn't see him be in any way confrontational. I didn't see him being in any way negative to anyone. He would go and ask a question, or he would add an opinion, or obviously with players, I would see him interact with some of the players off the court. And I've got to think that, again, he's as good a coach as you can get on the floor. And, you can see so many situations when he was on the floor in practice just got better because of his communication, which is the other part that, I thought Milwaukee did an outstanding job and Cleveland did an outstanding job in those two practices of emphasizing communication. And that's not to say the others didn't, but, I was really watching if Giannis and LeBron and, some of the stars, the Dwayne Wade, he practiced the second practice I saw in Cleveland. If those guys were engaged in practice as communicators and leaders, and I can say it was. I mean, they were all very engaged and, it wasn't that spoiled superstar type of mentality in any way.
Coach, this was a great conversation. We can probably do this for another few hours, and you have to come back. We'll talk some more about other things, or maybe we'll get on the court, the video camera, and do some stuff there. So I can't thank you enough for doing this and also sharing these insights. I feel like this is really revealing and to a lot of people who don't know what it's like in these NBA practices.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's long overdue, and I'd love to talk more. You do such a great job sharing the game of basketball, and I appreciate it, and you've stimulated some of my thinking, and I know we'll continue to do that. And for anyone that's interested, on basketballimmersion.com this week, I'll release a blog, too, with some of those notes that I already shared with you from the practices as well, so they can see some of those notes and diagrams and different things.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for coming on, and I appreciate being part of the conversation. And, well, don't forget, sports fans, at B-Ball Breakdown, we're not a channel, we're a conversation. You in? Are you in, Coach?
I'm in.